This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leonida Inge. ABC stores have been around for more than 90 years, and North Carolina residents seem to be comfortable with that history.
North Carolinians have always had this interesting relationship with alcohol, in that there were always sort of these forces that were trying to get people to drink less.
The podcast, The Broadside, tells us about the secret world of the Great Dismal Swamp.
You got mosquitoes, clouds of mosquitoes, a couple of types of poisonous snakes, a couple rattlers, and then the water moccasin. In fact, the world record-sized lengthwise water moccasin was found in the Dismal Swamp.
And it's been 1 year since flooding by Tropical Storm Chantal destroyed homes and businesses in Orange County. More on Due South. The news is next. Hi there. I'm Leonida Inge, host of Due South. Thanks for listening and supporting our podcasts. We work smart to bring you the best North Carolina and the South have to offer, from the latest in state politics to important voices in race and Southern culture. Due South is here every day. But we couldn't do it without your financial support. Thank you. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a donation today at WUNC.org. From the studios of WUNC News in Chapel Hill, this is Due South. I'm Leonida Inge. When Tropical Storm Chantal hit Chapel Hill, Carrboro, and surrounding communities on July 5th, 2025, no one could have imagined the impact of the flood and how long it would take to recover, especially residents who were caught in the storm's dangerous conditions.
It was so scary. The water was so high, come under my chest.
Joyce Lester, a 5-year resident of Camelot Village in Chapel Hill, said she was in her bedroom Sunday night when she saw the water enter her home. She was one of the people rescued by first responders when Bowlin Creek swelled from the 7 inches of rain and floodwaters rushed through the community off South Estes Drive.
Even 1 year later, some neighborhoods and communities are still struggling to rebuild. Housing units in 2 low-income neighborhoods, Airport Gardens and South Estes Drive, have not been fully restored. Hillsborough is still awaiting FEMA funds, and areas that have recovered over the past year continue to look for ways to prepare for future storms and flooding. I'm in the studio with Brighton McConnell, news director of 97.9 The Hill, WCHL, based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Brighton and his team have been covering the storm and its aftermath since last summer. Brighton, welcome to Due South.
Thank you so much, Leonida. It is wonderful to be here with you.
Well, Brighton, where were you when Tropical Storm Chantal stormed through? Was there damage to WCHL radio station?
There was damage to the station's AM tower site, which is different from where we have our main studios and our offices where we do our day-to-day work, but it is just down the street from where we do that stuff. I was at home on my couch watching a soccer game. I was hunkering down because I knew that there was a storm coming, but I was kind of keeping an eye on some flood alerts and had seen that there was a flood warning that had come through. And then all of a sudden, as the soccer game is winding down, I look at my phone and I see a picture.
Alert.
And I see a picture from Eastgate Crossing Shopping Center on East Franklin Street of cars underwater. And then before too long, we get an email from the town of Chapel Hill saying we're doing water rescues from people in low-lying areas, specifically Camelot Village along South Estes Drive. And then it doesn't take long for us to see on social media people at University Place Mall across the street from Camelot Village saying, oh my gosh, we're stuck in the movie theater, or oh my gosh, I had to leave my car in the mall parking lot because the water just rose so quickly. So I was thankful to be hunkered down, and it was one of those situations where we kept an eye on it overnight and shared as much as we could in the moment. But it wasn't really until the next morning that we had the full scope of the amount of flooding and destruction that had happened across our community.
Let's back up a little bit. Water rescues in Chapel Hill?
Right. Right. I mean, pretty unheard of. And it was across so many different parts of Orange County as well. The final total, I think, ended up being around 200 different water rescues in Orange County, which is just astounding. And I do think that folks in the Camelot Village area, if you've been around that, when it rains, you got to watch out for Bowling Creek swelling as much as it does. But it was just stunning. I think everybody was just so surprised to suddenly hear, oh my gosh, this is really happening. In part because the storm was so weird. Depending on where you were, you might have only seen a couple of inches of rain. But those parts of Chapel Hill saw 7 inches of rain. Others upstream saw 10. And then all that water came flooding in and rushing in. It was astounding.
And like you said, your work really began the next day. I mean, it had to really, even though we know it was a tropical storm, I mean, did it look like a hurricane had come through?
Right. Yes, it did. I mean, if you saw pictures from Eastgate Crossing, where again was very close to our station and our AM site is right across the street, it was unbelievable just how much mud and debris was caked there. Again, the University Place mall parking lot had all of these cars that were swept up into each other, and I was seeing people, returning to their cars and just trying to get into their trunks and opening their trunks and seeing how much water and how much debris had somehow gotten into the cars. It was pretty astounding. It very much felt like a hurricane, and it felt like a true disaster had struck. And I think everybody was very stunned in the short term, but were able to pretty quickly turn to rallying together and figuring out the best way to move forward.
Mm. We heard earlier in our conversation some of your reporting, out in the field. And I'm sure it was all hands on deck, making sure you captured some of the voices of the folks who were really surprised and struggling, during Chantal. Tell me about some of the other voices and people that you spoke with, I guess from business owners to everyday citizens.
Yes, spoke with a lot of folks who were flood victims themselves, spoke with a lot of folks who were there to try and help flood victims, whether they had an immediate connection to neighborhoods or people that were impacted or just saw that there was something horrendous that happened to their community and they wanted to step up. Yes, talked with a lot of business owners as well. And I think they understood at that time that it was a long recovery facing them. Anybody who lost their home very much understood that their next steps were very, very murky and unclear what was going to happen for them next. And even a year later from this, Leonida, it still is wildly varied from person to person where they are in their recovery process.
Well, based on how much money and maybe wealth you already had.
Absolutely. That's a big part of it. And because, again, the storm was so varied, you might have gotten some flood damage, but compared to somebody else down the road where, they had 4 feet of water in their homes, you're talking about different levels of damage there. And talking with a lot of business owners too, and the chamber as well, a lot of the businesses impacted, you're looking at it through very, very different lenses. Some people might have only suffered flood damage. Some people had the flood damage to the building and lost very valuable equipment with it. So, yeah, you're looking at huge financial losses and differences in what those losses are from person to person.
Can you give us an example of a place that you would think may have recovered by now, but hasn't? And I'm thinking of some of the more lower income housing.
Yeah. I'll point to Camelot Village, which is some of the naturally occurring affordable housing that is in Chapel Hill, and that a lot of folks point to, again, as this would not be built today based on current flood patterns and zonings. I mean, they are very squarely in a flood zone down there, and I think if someone is going to live there, they understand if they are on a first floor unit, the risks that come with that being so close to the water. Second floor folks have it a little bit differently, and those units are more coveted because they are protected. Camelot Village, if you drive through there, Leonida, you can tell it's still not quite right. There are a lot of people who faced long displacements, several weeks to months, and there might still be some folks who are going through that. It's tough to kind of get a quote from their management group and from residents, but we know from the town of Chapel Hill they issued 77 permits for construction and work to be done on different units within Camelot Village. And at the 1 year mark since Chantal, the town told us that 74 of those 77 permits are still open, have not been closed, and are still, in theory, having work done to them. So a lot still to be done there. And then you look at a place like Weatherhill Point in Carrboro, not a low-income neighborhood at all, but one that just was not prepared for the amount of water that they were going to see. They have this lovely kind of retention pond and feature in this neighborhood of 56 people that normally is beautiful, a little gazebo that kind of goes out over the water. But with how much water rushed their way that night, overflowed a little bit from University Lake and University Dam, they saw significant impact. And so that's a home of that's a neighborhood of 56 homes, 40 of them impacted by flood damage. And
that's a lot.
When we talked with the HOA president and residents at Weatherhill Point for the 1 year mark in our anniversary coverage, they said that there's still about a dozen houses that are empty. And it's a mix of, they still are awaiting repairs. Some of them have been bought by outside investors that have come in and are just holding the properties to eventually flip and add to their portfolio, or they already have been flipped for a significant profit, bought from residents who were just looking to try and get any sort of return on their investment right after the flooding happened. And one way or another, they're still looking at a good chunk of their homes empty too. So those are just two examples of how things are not quite right. And some people have moved back into both of those neighborhoods, but a lot of folks are still adjusting and maybe ultimately will never end up moving back into those neighborhoods.
In the meantime, we do know big businesses, you know, some of the anchor stores like your Trader Joe's and your Silver Spot Cinema, they're finally back open.
They are. And we saw them return, some of them sooner rather than later. They were able to move together pretty quickly. It definitely seems like if you're a company that has other locations, you're a national brand, you have some overhead to work with. Some other stores, locally owned or smaller franchises, have taken a little while to come back. But out of the about 100 businesses that had flood damage or so, it seems like the vast majority of those have reopened. And I was pleasantly surprised that when we were doing our anniversary coverage, I heard from a lot of business owners that said that they feel like they have seen a true uptick in business, and that they have not seen that the flood and the disruption that came with that has really put them behind in getting customers back in the door for, whether that's a store, a restaurant, whatever, which is very encouraging.
That's good news.
I mean, I feel like it's so often in today's world where we have so many different stories and so many different people, places, things that we care about that need help, that you pay a lot of attention to it in the short term, and then you kind of move on to the next crisis you want to try and help with. But from a lot of the businesses that I've talked with, they said that they have rebounded fairly well.
I'm here with Brighton McConnell. He's news director of 97.9 The Hill, WCHL, at chapelboro.com. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a real treat.
This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leonida Inge. This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leonida Inge. For centuries, the Great Dismal Swamp on the border of North Carolina and Virginia served as a sanctuary for the escaped enslaved. Today, the same harsh conditions that shielded those self-emancipated people from slavery made it difficult for historians and archeologists to understand the extent of their settlements. But that secret world is slowly being uncovered. Our colleagues at WUNC's podcast, The Broadside, have the story. Here's host Anissa Khalifa.
The Great Dismal Swamp was a radical world. And the landscape is of such a nature that it nurtures resistors, those who resist, if they want to use it. And many did.
This is archaeologist Dan Sayers. For decades, Dan has explored and studied the mucky and mysterious region that straddles North Carolina and Virginia's coastal border. So we're here to talk about the Great Dismal Swamp, which I understand you are a little bit of an expert in.
It's getting there, yeah.
So I've never been to the Great Dismal Swamp. Could you describe what the Great Dismal Swamp is like?
Oh, okay. Well, before you go into the swamp, you're kind of usually on the western edge, and you just see this 30-mile long wall of trees, basically. And when you go into the swamp, you're going in only a handful of places along that whole western edge, usually. And so what it starts to look like is a real thick, dense tree stand with a lot of standing water underneath it, a lot of thick foliage and like vines and small shrubs or big shrubs. And it's a beautiful feeling, but it's like, wow, I'm really in a place, right? There's a lot of character here, natural and otherwise. There's that peaty water across the whole swamp. It's a layer of peat, right? And it's between a couple feet and as far as 15, 20 feet thick, depending on where you are in the swamp. There's a unique smell to it, and it's a pleasant one that, I kind of finally remember all the hours, days, weeks, months, and years I've logged slogging around out there. And you got mosquitoes, clouds of mosquitoes there were days that, honestly, I don't think I'm exaggerating, that I probably couldn't see 15 feet.
Wow.
Because of the cloud of mosquitoes surrounding me.
That's terrifying, honestly.
Yeah. And you look at your arm, right? Yeah. Couple of types of poisonous snakes, a couple rattlers, and then the water moccasin. In fact, the world record-sized lengthwise water moccasin was found in the Dismal Swamp. 7-8 feet, some crazy length like that. And then black bear. I got to know a few of them a little bit from a distance over the years. But yeah, it's a refuge, right?
Indeed, today the Great Dismal Swamp is a designated national wildlife refuge. But its legacy as a refuge extends way beyond the natural environment, which takes us back to Dan's introduction to the swamp in the early 2000s. Back then, he was sifting through historical documents related to the region, and something kept coming up.
There were whispers across all these old documents that it seemed possible that there was a good number of what are known as maroons.
Maroons. These were people who fled slavery and evaded recapture by living in remote locations.
It's formerly enslaved people of African descent who went into places just like the Great Dismal Swamp to just basically get themselves out of that enslaving racist world, right, that they found themselves in.
This notion that people had sought protection in the swamp ignited Dan's archaeological curiosity, partly because he wasn't totally on board with popular thinking at the time about maroons in American history.
There was this general idea that marooning happened everywhere in this hemisphere, South America, Caribbean, Central America, but for some reason, everyone was pretty convinced somehow the now U.S. was an exception to that, for the most part. And whatever marooning happened, it was really short-term.
With the Great Dismal Swamp in particular, historical evidence and personal narratives prove that people did hide out on the outer edge of the wetland. It was often used as a short-term sanctuary as they made their way to the north. But what about deep inside the swamp? Were there permanent maroon settlements?
No one had bothered to necessarily do the research to really prove that position, right?
So Dan got a shovel, enlisted the help of some brave research assistants, and embarked on a mission.
I thought it was worth a sort of risk, if you will. Let's go out and see what we can find now, if anything.
Dan and his crew hacked their way through thick vines and vegetation, sidestepping poisonous snakes along the way. Their goal was to find a rare thing in any swamp: some good, dry ground.
Pretty much anyone that lived in the standing water part of the swamp as opposed to the edge, they lived on dry ground. I didn't know what they looked like. No one could tell me. There was no photo of them. There was no previous archaeological work. So we just picked fairly random locations in the heart of the swamp and see if we could find something that we would say, yeah, that looks like dry ground.
For months, Dan looked for this golden plot of land where he could start an archaeological dig. He was hoping for something obvious, like a hill to excavate. But in the swamp, he quickly found out that elevation is relative.
And it turns out it wasn't these little places, weren't these little hills out there. They're called islands, right? These things are like 20, 40 acres in size, so they're pretty big.
Oh, wow.
So you walk on these islands, you can almost sense people being there. It's just so perfect. You slog it through all this standing water, and suddenly you're basically in the woods, right?
This is where Dan and his team started to work. And soon enough, some small artifacts turned up.
Little pieces, sometimes an arrowhead or a projectile point. You know, the excitement, oh my gosh, right? I remember the days when we'd find a lead shot at one of the, this is exciting.
But those early finds were few and far between.
It was just a light scatter.
And he says that wasn't entirely surprising, because if maroons were in the swamp, they would have been people who had very deliberately left behind the outside world.
They're staying out there, and so you have one conclusion when you choose that, which is we got to make do with what the swamp provides us.
Which means they used a lot of natural resources, like wood, things that rot and don't leave behind much of a footprint. So where could those arrowheads and most of the other small artifacts have come from?
They were the things that ancient people had left behind. Ancient Native Americans, ancient Indigenous Americans. They, too, went out in the swamp.
Dan says it wasn't until the early 1600s that historical records show evidence of anyone else living in the area.
After 1619 is when the first person of African descent, probably as a maroon, went into the Dismal.
But over time, as colonial expansion pushed indigenous people out of the region and further entrenched slavery in the South, the swamp saw more marooning visitors and fewer Native Americans. So Dan had found his hallowed dry ground. And there were clues, a mix of European and native artifacts that pointed to people who were once on the island. But were these the remnants of Native American hunting parties, maroons just passing through, or might this confirm a more long-term settlement in the swamp's deep interior? Dan kept digging, and soon got his answer.
I have a very distinct memory of when I realized I had exposed a cabin. It was an aha moment. I'd say that's when I realized we had, for sure, evidence of a permanent community out here.
This was a huge discovery, and it was just the beginning.
This is Due South on WUNC News. You're listening to an excerpt from the Broadside and its episode titled Secrets of the Great Dismal Swamp. The story continues now with host Anissa Khalifa.
Once archaeologist Dan Sayers found evidence of a cabin deep inside the Great Dismal Swamp, more and more clues of a permanent maroon community fell into place.
We'd see one of these dark stains, so a half circle or something. Oh, wow, that could be a post hole or a fire pit edge or something. And so I was finding cabin footprints, and even a little bit later in the project found what I'm interpreting as a community defense structure.
How much land have you excavated within the swamp?
Well, let's see here. At 20-acre island, we covered about 0.00003% of it in terms of horizontal amounts we could have dug across the surface. But we dug at other sites too. So I want to say something like 500 square meters total excavation across 8 sites, 8 islands. There are hundreds potentially of islands out there.
From his findings, Dan made the case that a mix of maroon and indigenous communities lived on these small islands for generations.
Yeah, this was a continuous occupation from about Jamestown all the way to the Civil War, at least.
So what did you learn about their living conditions? What was their way of life?
When we think about basically as much as you can imagine, self-reliant community, at least, again, in the interior with the indigenous and maroon communities, it takes work, right? Self-reliance is not an easy job here. So you got, on one island, you might have had 100, 150 people living. If you were a fly on the wall, you would see a village of people kind of going about their business. If they're not going out to harvest, they're processing the grains in whatever ways, putting things up for storage. There'd be kids running around. There'd be elders. There'd be wise folks, right, who read the conditions of the world and everything that we think of about as a society, it's there.
did slave catchers ever come looking for the maroons? Like, was that a serious threat to their communities?
They did not. So-called slave catchers, right, did not go deep into the swamp. From 1620 or 30 or 40, when the first maroons went in, all the way up to about 1800 or so, you didn't have much evidence at all of anybody from the outside world going in. And it's like, yeah, of course, maroons and these folks were very afraid of the slave catchers. In some cases, they were, sure. But in this case, they were really safe deep in the swamp. And here's the reason why. You're not going in on boats. You're not going in on horses, you being the would-be catchers. You're going in on foot. You got to know the swamp. And I can tell from experience, that takes a while. You got to know where you're going. And then last but not least, and most important for the point, the outside world knew there were potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of people out there. You think you're going to take your little crew of 5 people or 10 or 20 out in the swamp, wait in there, find one of these communities, and what, they're just going to give up?
So deep inside the Great Dismal Swamp, maroon communities were cocooned away from the outside world. But on the swamp's edges, it was a whole different story. Starting in the mid-1700s, a wealthy colonist set his sights on the wetland.
He had this sort of dream of draining the swamp and reaping all sorts of profit from the products of the drainage.
The big ticket item? Lumber.
Yeah, it was the trees.
Eventually, a company was set up to build a canal along the eastern side of the swamp. It was formed by a few Virginian elites, including none other than George Washington.
So they started what still stands, it's Washington Ditch. And when I say they, I mean they brought in enslaved workers to dig the ditch. Those guys just sat on their horses and did whatever rich guys do. And then they just started this harvesting of lumber, right? And they used that canal.
And it was here, along the canal, where enslaved workers lived.
These communities or settlements were kind of all over the swamp, right along these canals.
There's even evidence these enslaved canal workers exchanged goods and resources with maroons deeper in the swamp. Together, these two groups established a kind of barter economy. The maroons would offer things like raw timber, and the canal workers would give them stuff like tobacco in return. And they were doing all of this right under the canal company's nose.
It's the biggest, terribly kept secret in southeastern Virginia. These tacitly accepted informal economies.
Marcus Navius is a history professor at the University of Missouri and the author of a book on the Great Dismal Swamp called City of Refuge. Marcus says it might be surprising that white company men turned a blind eye to these exchanges, but it could answer another lingering mystery about the swamp.
One of the distinctive features of the Great Dismal Swamp is that it never generated a massive state or federal military response. And I think it's the tacit acceptance of these informal economies that explains that most. It's not the fact that these maroons were not feared, they were. It's not the fact that they represented freedom for others, they did. It's the fact that they were integral to land and canal companies' efforts to make something of the Great Dismal Swamp in the context of a slave society. And that just blew my mind to smithereens.
But despite this culture of quid pro quo, it's not as if the canal was exempt from the cruelty of slavery. Far from it.
This was not a place where freedom came easily, at all.
For evidence of that, Marcus says to look no further than the narrative of Moses Grandy. Grandy was an enslaved waterman who worked in the swamp until he was eventually able to buy his freedom.
In 1843, Grandy's narrative is put to paper and published for the first time. In the following year, I think, the information largely local about the Great Dismal Swamp becomes a bit more of a national saga. It is really slow and painstaking labor for the enslaved people whose job it is to cut roots and dig out trees by hand and the like.
He described very vividly some of the conditions, horrific things that our ancestors endured. The enslaved people in that labor camp that hand dug that canal.
This is Eric Shepard. He runs a heritage tourism business based in Williamsburg, Virginia. Years ago, Eric went on a genealogical journey. He did some deep research into his family and discovered that he was a distant relation to Moses Grandy. Inspired by that revelation, Eric now leads historical tours of the Great Dismal Swamp.
Everywhere that Moses went, I've then found other Grandy family relatives, all of us tracing our roots back there. And I used to say to people, I said, all these trees around here that's been around here for hundreds of years, if those trees could talk, they could tell you certain things. So I would just share with the wind, letting the ancestors know I was looking for them. Where are you? I'm walking the same ground. It's a lot of people that have hidden or untold stories that I think Moses Grandy's slave narrative can help in healing and making sure the others are recognized and honored too for having gone through that trauma.
Today, the Great Dismal Swamp looks a lot different than when people like Moses Grandy worked the canal. Originally, the swamp was about 2,000 square miles, but over time, it's shrunk to a fraction of its original size.
About 190 square miles.
Oh, wow. So less than 10% of the original.
Yeah, less than.
Wow.
Yeah.
Archaeologist Dan Sayers says the logging and drainage operations were major factors. Farmland now sits on much of the original swamp. But in recent decades, there have been successful efforts to protect the remaining wetlands. And that's allowed historians and scientists to also preserve the incredible history of its maroon communities. Dan says we're just beginning to uncover the secrets of the swamp. And they point to a brave and resilient people.
The resistance I see is etched into that landscape. And I just find that amazing. They said, no, I'm done with it. That to me is pretty inspirational, in particular, thinking through how to make our future different in a good way. We can get creative ourselves with some of this information we're gleaning from the past, right? And just, you never know. You never know what you're going to come up with once you know about it.
And for descendants like Eric Shepard, that preservation effort is a personal, even spiritual mission, a way to reach back across the centuries and honor his ancestors, who were overlooked for far too long.
We have not forgotten you. We're looking for you, and with what we're trying to do to make sure people are aware, not only the swamp, but the people of the swamp, that we share their stories as best we can and remember them.
Thanks to our WUNC colleagues at the Broadside, you can find additional episodes at WUNC.org or your favorite podcast platform. Coming up, North Carolina's history with ABC stores. I'm Leonida Inge, and this is Due South.
This Due South interview originally aired in July 2025.
I'm Leonida Inge, and this is Due South on WUNC. North Carolina's population continues to grow, and a lot of that influx is people moving here from other states. I remember when I moved here more than 20 years ago, there's an adjustment period. Some things are just different, the food, the vibe, and where you have to go to get your favorite bottle of booze. That's because North Carolina is one of more than a dozen states where the government controls liquor sales, and I've always wondered why and what it says about North Carolina. Today on Due South, those questions get answered by Jeremy Markovich. He's a writer, producer, and podcaster living outside of Greensboro and runs the website and newsletter North Carolina Rabbit Hole. And one of his recent posts is titled, "The First ABC Store Opened 90 Years Ago. Why Does North Carolina Still Have Them?" Jeremy, welcome to Due South.
Thanks for having me.
So was learning about ABC stores just one of those adjustments you made when you moved to North Carolina?
Yeah, it was very much like, why do we why do we have them? And especially when I first moved to North Carolina, I lived in Charlotte. And there's a very big difference between like, hey, we're going to go buy a bottle of Jack Daniels down the street versus going down to South Carolina. And there's liquor stores right on the border with colorful names like Frugal McDougal. Somebody I used to work with actually opened his own liquor store right across the border in South Carolina called Sauce Monkey Spirits. Like, it's just a different landscape. And so it was very visible there.
They don't have any rules there. We have rules in North Carolina.
Everything's legal in South Carolina. That's where your fireworks are, and that's where your non-state run liquor stores are with colorful names.
And that's when you must have gotten to the point, I need to write about this.
Yeah. It was always in the background. And I think when I saw something that popped across my timeline that said, hey, the first liquor store opened 90 years ago in July in Wilson, North Carolina, I was like, that seems like a good time to actually look into why we've had these things for 90 years. How come we still do it the same way we did it 90 years ago?
Well, let's first identify the landscape. Is there anywhere in North Carolina that containers of liquor can be purchased that's not from an ABC store? Can you think of any place? And are all the stores run by the state?
No. It's all run basically as if Prohibition is still in effect, and all of the laws are carve-outs from Prohibition. So in other places, you might think, oh, well, we can regulate it, but like we start with the idea that something is legal until we say it's not. The laws, because of North Carolina's history, have kind of grown out of like everything is alcohol-related, not legal until we say it is. So what you have is if you want to do something with alcohol, you have to ask permission from the voters to be able to do it. So that is sort of the starting landscape for North Carolina based on its history and based on the way that things have gone for 90 years.
How many ABC stores are there actually? And who actually controls them? Is there like still an entrepreneur who maybe puts in an application like I want an ABC store and gives the state a cut? How does that work?
No. So North Carolina, by the way, not unique in the fact that it has state-run liquor stores. I mean, there are, I think, more than a dozen, maybe 16 or 17 at last check. And in a lot of places, it is sort of like top-down state-run, where this is the state kind of sort of centralizes all the operations. And North Carolina has some of that. There's like a central liquor warehouse in Raleigh, and it kind of works like that. And what you find is it's actually sort of local control. There are more than 170 local ABC boards that sort of control locally where they go and they run them, and that money then will go back toward local causes and that sort of a thing. It's sort of like, imagine if you had the lottery like North Carolina does, but instead of having one agency in Raleigh that kind of runs the lottery for everybody and they kind of farm it out to whatever gas station where you want to buy your ticket, you have like 170 different little boards that run their own lotteries, and they're all under the same framework, but it's all sort of local. So it's locally controlled, even though it's state run. And it gets, if you're confused right now, if you're like, oh gosh, this is making my head hurt, that's kind of the way that it is.
It's making me think there's room for corruption. That's what it makes me think.
There has been.
Or, like maybe you have to know the right people to get a license.
Yeah. The biggest complaint among many about the system is that it is not efficient. That if you're a bar or, I don't know, a restaurant and you want to get, stock your bar and be able to make cocktails for folks, you have to run through sort of the local ABC board. You have to run through all this stuff. And the hard part about it is that there are always complaints like, oh, well, we don't have what we need, or it takes too long to get it, or now if you're like an end user, you're going to a liquor store, one of the complaints is like, oh, but I wanted this specific brand and they don't stock it or they don't carry it or they ran out. And they're sort of not responsive to a customer's needs like other stores might be, right? Like if you went to your favorite store and they knew an item was popular and they could restock it, they would probably get as many as they possibly could because they knew there was a demand for it. That's not really how liquor stores work. And while there are some that sort of, that there's some friendly people there, they've been working there for a long time, they're helpful, they're not trying to, they're just kind of working within the bounds of what they do. That is sort of the landscape for all of these stores. And that is a little bit by design. So part of the reason back in the day when they set the system up was they didn't want to make it sort of the commercial pressures that might be on a regular liquor store, right? Like if everybody wants Johnny Walker Blue, then that store is probably going to try to get as much as they possibly can because they'll make a bunch of profit. Well, if you're the state store and you want to control this, dangerous product called liquor, then they basically they're not driven by profit. So they're not going to stock it if they don't want to or they can't get it. And if there's complaints like, well, what are you going to do? You can't go across the street and go to a competitor to do it. You might go to a different ABC store that may have it, but they're only competing against themselves, really. And so that is a little bit by design, again, because alcohol in North Carolina, if you go way back, has been seen as this very dangerous thing. And we are still living, as in so many ways and so many things, with the inertia of things that happened long ago.
And when you mention history, you wrote that the origins of the ABC store in North Carolina are in, I guess, what else? Politics and Jim Crow laws?
Yeah. So if
Not surprised by that.
North Carolinians have always had this interesting relationship with alcohol, in that there were always sort of these forces that were trying to get people to drink less. And this is pre-Civil War. And one of the things about it was this was maybe like the cause of churches, right? Like churches are trying to keep people from the dangers of alcoholism, the dangers of saloons, of taverns, of places where people go and drink and get drunk. And if you look at through old newspapers, there's like stories of like, oh no, the drunken farmers are at it again. Like there's this sort of thing around alcohol, but it's not really like a big movement. It's sort of contained to the church. And after the Civil War, what you have is all of these different forces start to come together and they say, okay, we actually probably should do something about this. But it's not a very popular movement, right? It's sort of still fringy. And at one point in the 1880s, some of these forces for, like the dry forces, you might want to call them, they start coming together and like, oh, you know what we're going to do? Actually, I think the time is right. We're going to put this thing on the ballot statewide and say, like, we should have prohibition in the 1880s.
And it won.
And no, it lost.
Lost?
People were like, no, we don't want any part of that. Like that's a bit much. Maybe it's okay if you control it a little bit, but like banning it altogether, no.
But they had to have another vote.
They did.
I know.
So what that gave these kind of dry forces was this like, okay, so if we go too big, nobody wants to do it. Like nobody wants prohibition overall. So what we're going to kind of do is start chipping away a little bit by a little bit. And you mentioned Jim Crow. One of the ways that this came into being was they were so worried that like if the Democrats, who were the conservative party at the time and they were in control, and this is like, past Reconstruction, they were worried that like if you just kind of put this out there to like the general population, it's going to lose. And if you say we're going to campaign on the anti-liquor forces, that's going to split the vote, and the other party has an opportunity to come in and win, especially if you split that vote. So one, they started to kind of very small, very in small ways chip away at sort of this movement. So the other thing that happened was around 1900, when these laws start going into effect and you start disenfranchising the black vote, well, now you're not really worried as much about splitting the white vote over liquor. So they started saying, okay, we're going to start doing little things that are going to chip away at this. So in 1903, they ban the making and selling of liquor outside of towns. Because one Democratic U.S. senator used to call these like little, these little liquor operations Republican recruiting stations. So like, well, if we shut those down, there goes all the Republican recruiting stations. So they shut them down in 1903. A couple of years later, they ban the same thing in small towns. Now, small towns at the time was 1,000 people or less. So now you're banning it in more rural areas, and you can only get liquor in these bigger cities. And this starts coinciding with this bigger movement that's across the country to start banning alcohol. A woman named Carrie Nation shows up in 1907. She had been barnstorming across North Carolina, And she shows up in Salisbury. She called it a hellhole with plenty of poverty, degradation, suffering. You know what's causing it? Smoking and drinking.
Smoking and drinking. This is a great history lesson with Jeremy Markovich. He runs the website and newsletter North Carolina Rabbit Hole and is taking on this history of ABC stores in North Carolina. So now so much smoking and drinking.
Mm-hmm.
I guess some people are happy with that. It was already going on. But I kind of want to skip to when finally, we had the first opening, in the 1930s? I'm just wondering if there was like a rush, on alcohol sales.
I mean, no. And I think the reason why, according to accounts at the time, it was just sort of like they likened it to the opening of a new grocery store. Now, I've been to people freak out over Publix. Maybe this is more like a not quite Publix opening level, but it was just sort of like, well, they opened up another store. And part of the reason is that when it opened in Wilson, other stores across Eastern North Carolina were all about to open. So the way this came about was North Carolina before national prohibition had prohibition in North Carolina. They banned it. So they figured out after chipping away, the tide starts to turn, and North Carolina passes it in 1909 with 62% of the vote. So you have over 20, 30 years, this shift, and it goes into effect in North Carolina. Nationally, it happens. What happens nationally was prohibition didn't stop really anybody from drinking alcohol. They just had to go find their friendly neighborhood bootlegger to go get them some booze. Or in North Carolina, it was still legal if there was medicinal purposes. So you're like, Doc, I'm not feeling great. Can I have a fifth of Jack Daniels to help my headache? You could go still get it for those reasons. Or communion wine. You can still do communion wine.
Well, I'm trying to figure out how prudish is North Carolina still to this day? Because I do know in your article, you wrote that it was 1978, a person could not even get a bottle off the shelf themselves. It's a lot of control still here.
It's a lot of control, and I think what you have at the beginning, again, is you have to get a carve-out to be able to do anything. So even in this last legislative session, now happy hours have not always been banned, but they were banned. You could do happy hours. Now you can't do specials like that. So they've been effectively banned. Well, I don't know. You can go to any other state, many other states, and they have happy hours and that sort of a thing. And they tried to pass sort of an ABC every couple of years. They do ABC reform bills. Let's make some little changes. Didn't pass. And it's just, think about how hard it is to pass any law. And then when you're doing it around alcohol, it's still very hard.
Because I wonder, do North Carolinians even like these ABC stores?
They don't. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but when they do surveys, they say, should you privatize it? People are like, yeah, we should. It's not 100%, but it's always usually a majority. I think the last survey I saw or poll they did was in 2023, and it was the same deal. We should privatize this thing. And that kind of runs into sort of the local control spigot of money that goes from ABC stores to other local causes, these local commissions. It's like asking somebody to give up power voluntarily, hey, you should lose this position that you currently have, is very, very hard. And so what doesn't make sense on a state level, and it doesn't work logistically very well, or it does. I guess it could work better, depending on. I'm sure if you ask the ABC folks, they're like, oh yeah, this works great. This is good. But people are like, well, there's room for improvement. If it was privatized, it'd be better. You could still tax this sort of thing. You can still make money off of it. It's just very, very hard to do. And so, think of all the laws in North Carolina that are so outdated that you can't even get a token repeal passed. And then try to do that something for as active as alcohol, where people have a lot of strong opinions to this day, both for and against. It's hard. It's really politically hard.
Well, what did this deep dive teach you about North Carolina? We're closet drinkers.
So, this is an interesting stat. I think this is something Business North Carolina basically, a lot of people have written about this over the years. I am not the first person to have done something on this by far. And a couple of years ago, this is something that kind of came up. In 2019, the state report found that North Carolina collects more taxes per gallon of liquor sold than any other southern state. We rank 4th nationally. So we get a lot of tax money off of it in the current system. liquor prices and ABC profit margins, pretty high. Liquor consumption per capita, among the lowest in the United States. Now, if you're looking at this and you're saying, well, see, this is why we need to have the ABC system in place, right? Like, liquor consumption is down. That is a good thing, right? And yet, if you are sort of for the free market, you will say, no, this is like Republicans, even people that are on these committees want to privatize it, and they've found it to be very, very hard. People run for governor saying like, we want to privatize the liquor stores, and people are like, oh yeah, go do it. They get into office, and then they don't actually talk about it again. So I think what we have found about liquor stores or whatever else is that in some ways we are still living in the past in North Carolina. We are still products of the people who came before us. And the people who came before us really had a hard time with just letting anybody do what they wanted with alcohol. And we are still living with that today.
Jeremy Markovich is a writer, producer, and podcaster based outside of Greensboro, and he runs the website and newsletter North Carolina Rabbit Hole. Man, I need a drink of water. We have the toast.
Cheers.
Cheers. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me on Due South, Jeremy.
Thank you.
I'm Leonida Inge, and you've been listening to Due South on WUNC.
Each story you hear on Planet Money starts with a question. What happens if we refund tariffs? Why are groceries so expensive? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious, because the forces shaping our world can be hard to see. Follow NPR's Planet Money wherever you get your podcasts and start seeing how the economy really works.
The fatal shooting of a teenager at a protest in Seattle has gone unsolved for 6 years.
This is open in your face. How are there no answers?
Our investigation has uncovered new evidence and witnesses who say they've never talked to police.
Did police ever call you? Not once.
Listen to We Keep Us Safe, a new true crime series on the Embedded podcast from NPR.